They say the end of the world doesn't come with fire or thunder. It comes with the silence of a man who doesn't understand that the world has already ended. Imagine it a cold night in Ekaterinburg, 1918, the sound of boots on wooden floors, the echo of whispered orders, a man, his wife, his children, standing in the shadows of their own empire, waiting for something they cannot name, the smell of oil lamps, the metallic weight of inevitability, and in the center of it all stands Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov, the last Tsar of all the Russias. The man who once held the largest empire on earth now stands smaller than the room around him. Not in stature, but in consequence. He blinks as the rifles are raised. In that final moment, there are no crowns, no banners, no hymns of divine right, just breath, trembling in the dark. That sound, soft, human, terrified, is how empires die, but this isn't where the story begins. No. The fall of Nicholas Tsar begins in the fog, born from mystery, gilded by ritual, and sealed in the illusion that he was chosen by God himself. To understand his end, you must first step into his beginning. He was born on a winter's day in 1868, in the glittering halls of Tsarskoye Selo, a palace so vast it seemed carved from dreams. Outside, peasants trudged through snow and mud. Inside, chandeliers poured golden light across marble floors, where little Nicholas took his first steps beneath ceilings painted with angels. From birth, he was told he was divine, anointed by the Almighty, destined to rule over millions. But destiny can be a curse when it comes wrapped in silk and silence. The boy who would become the last Tsar was raised not by the world, but apart from it. His tutors drilled him in the duties of autocracy, yet shielded him from the truth of his people's suffering. His father, Alexander Koy, the Iron Tsar, was a mountain of a man, fierce and uncompromising. Nicholas was nothing like him. Where his father's voice could command armies, Nicholas's trembled with politeness. He was quiet, soft-spoken, almost fragile. And perhaps that was the first tragedy. The empire had created a god but raised a boy. Imagine him standing beside his father during parades, soldiers thundering past, the crowd roaring, "Long live the Tsar!" while Nicholas's mind wandered elsewhere. He loved books, family, the gentle order of gardens more than the politics of power. But in Russia, power wasn't optional. It was inherited like a sentence, and Nicholas inherited it too soon. In 1894, when his father suddenly died, Nicholas was thrust onto the throne. He was 26. His wedding to Alexandra Fyodorovna, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, was supposed to be a moment of joy, but it came draped in mourning. The empire barely finished burying one Tsar before crowning the next, and Nicholas, in that fragile moment, whispered to his cousin, "I am not ready to be Tsar. I never wanted to be." But history doesn't ask for readiness. It demands obedience. His coronation was spectacle and curse rolled into one. May 1896, Moscow's Kodinka field. 500,000 people gathered for a festival to celebrate their new ruler. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and anticipation. But what began as a celebration turned into a nightmare. Rumors spread that the coronation gifts, bread, meat, mugs bearing the Tsar's portrait, were running out. The crowd surged forward. The ground gave way. In the chaos, more than 1,000 people were crushed to death. Nicholas was horrified, but the next day, under pressure from his advisors, he attended a lavish ball thrown by the French ambassador. The news spread like wildfire. The people began to whisper, "The new Tsar brings death wherever he goes." It was a stain that would never wash off. But even then, destiny seemed to play tricks on him. His wife, Alexandra, was deeply religious, more mystic than monarch. She believed Nicholas was chosen by God to redeem Russia. She saw omens in dreams, divine messages in the flicker of candles. Together they built a world of ritual and superstition. When their only son Alexei was born in 1904, joy turned to dread when they discovered he carried the Romanov curse, hemophilia, A single wound could kill him, and it was that curse that would draw darkness into their palace in the form of a man named Grigory Rasputin. But that's later. For now, imagine the royal chambers at night, the Tsarina praying before icons, tears glistening on her cheeks, Nicholas pacing silently, the weight of a dying empire pressing on his shoulders. He had inherited a country that stretched across 11 time zones, ruled by ancient bureaucracy and frozen in the past, while Europe marched into the modern age with factories, constitutions, and revolutions. Russia clung to its old ghosts. The peasants were starving, the workers restless, the aristocracy decaying behind velvet curtains, and Nicholas, in his golden cage, believed that by sheer will, or divine right, he could hold it all together. That belief would become his undoing. He saw himself as a father to his people. He loved them in the abstract, but feared them in the flesh. To him, reform meant weakness, democracy meant chaos. So when the winds of change swept across Europe, Nicholas stood still. He believed autocracy was sacred, that to bend was to betray God. Yet every year, the pressure grew. Beneath the frozen soil of Russia, something was moving. The first tremor came from the east. In 1904, Nicholas made a catastrophic decision to go to war with Japan. He thought it would be quick, glorious, a chance to unite his people in victory. But the Russo-Japanese War became a humiliation. The mighty Russian navy was obliterated by a nation he considered inferior. When news of defeat reached home, the illusion of the Tsar's invincibility cracked. Then came the year 1905, a Sunday in January. Thousands of workers marched through St. Petersburg carrying icons and portraits of the Tsar, singing hymns. They came not to rebel, but to beg. They wanted better wages, fair hours, dignity. They believed the Little Father would listen. They were wrong. Imperial guards opened fire. The snow turned red. Dozens, maybe hundreds, were killed. It became known as Bloody Sunday, and from that day on, the people no longer saw their Tsar as a father, but as a butcher. The empire trembled. Riots, strikes, mutinies. The ghost of revolution haunted every city. Nicholas, frightened and confused, was forced to sign the October Manifesto, granting limited freedoms and creating a parliament, the Duma. It was a compromise he despised. To him, it was sacrilege. To the revolutionaries, it was not enough. He had given away just enough power to look weak, but not enough to earn trust, a fatal balance. Through it all, Nicholas retreated into family life. He found comfort in his wife, his children, his prayers, and in that fragile sanctuary Rasputin arrived. A wandering mystic, dirty, magnetic, terrifyingly persuasive, he promised healing for Alexei, and when the boy miraculously recovered, Rasputin became indispensable. To Alexandra, he was a saint. To Nicholas's ministers, he was poison. The empire whispered about Rasputin's debauchery, his drinking, his women, his dark influence over the throne. But Nicholas refused to see it. To question Rasputin would mean questioning God's plan, and Nicholas never questioned God. As the years passed, Russia decayed beneath the weight of superstition and denial. Ministers came and went. The people's faith turned to anger. The aristocracy plotted, the workers organized, and somewhere in the distance, a new storm gathered, the Great War. In 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, Nicholas saw an opportunity. Perhaps war could unite Russia again. The drums began to beat. The soldiers marched under banners of the double-headed eagle. The Tsar declared his love for his people, and they cheered. For a moment, he believed the old dream could return, but the First World War was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Trenches swallowed men by the thousands. Disease, hunger, frostbite, it was slaughter on an industrial scale. And the Russian army, ill-equipped and poorly led, bled out in the mud. Nicholas visited the front, and soldiers still saluted him with reverence. But behind their eyes, there was something else. Fatigue, betrayal, despair. The letters home told the truth. The Tsar sends us to die. By 1916, millions were dead. Food shortages ravaged cities. The railways collapsed, and in the heart of St. Petersburg, now renamed Petrograd, the people began to whisper the forbidden word again, revolution. And yet, Nicholas remained convinced that faith would save him. He prayed more, listened more to Alexandra. She, in turn, listened only to Rasputin. Ministers begged the Tsar to act. Generals warned him of mutiny. But Nicholas, stubborn and serene, wrote in his diary, "All is well. The Lord will not abandon Russia." It's almost unbearable to read those words now, because by then, Russia had already abandoned him. Imagine the Winter Palace in those last years, golden halls echoing with silence, courtiers walking on eggshells, Rasputin's shadow lingering like incense. Outside, the streets trembled with hunger, soldiers deserted by the thousands. Bread lines stretched for miles. The divine empire had become a starving nation ruled by ghosts. And through it all, Nicholas smiled that same calm, distant smile, because he could not imagine a world without him on the throne. That's the great irony of history. The men who believe themselves eternal are often the first to vanish. As 1917 approached, the storm finally broke. But that is another chapter. Winter, 1917. The empire of the Romanovs was a dying beast, bleeding, starving, stumbling through the snow, pretending it still had breath. The streets of Petrograd had become rivers of frost and hunger. Factories stood silent, chimneys cold. Bread lines stretched like funeral processions. Soldiers returned from the front not as heroes but as ghosts, hollow-eyed, carrying more rage than rifles. And in the palaces of power, Nicholas still prayed for divine guidance. But even God had gone silent. The whispers of rebellion had turned into a roar. In February, the women marched first, tired of waiting for bread, tired of burying sons. Their cries of "Peace, bread, freedom!" echoed through the frozen air. Soldiers sent to stop them lowered their weapons. Some joined the crowd. Others fired, but the bullets did nothing to stop the tide. The revolution had begun, not with speeches or banners, but with hunger. In a few days, the entire capital was in revolt. Ministers fled. Generals hesitated. The Duma declared itself in session, defying the Tsar. Yet Nicholas, at his army headquarters hundreds of miles away, refused to see it. His telegraphs were full of platitudes. "The trouble will pass," he wrote. "The people are loyal." But the people were no longer his. His empire was crumbling faster than he could pray. He ordered troops to restore order, but the railways were cut. Communication failed. His soldiers refused to obey. The divine chain of command, one God, one Tsar, one people, had shattered. By the time he decided to return to Petrograd, it was already too late. The revolutionaries had seized control. Trains carrying Nicholas were diverted. Every station he passed through was colder, emptier. He looked out at his empire from the window of a royal carriage and saw no subjects waiting to greet him, only the silent snow. The illusion of absolute power dissolved somewhere between those rails. By March, his generals gathered in a cold railway carriage in Pskov and told him the truth: the army no longer supported him. To continue would mean civil war. Nicholas, the autocrat of all the Russias, the anointed of God, sat quietly and signed a document that ended 300 years of Romanov rule. The pen shook in his hand. In that moment, the empire didn't explode, it exhaled. The age of the Tsars ended not with fire, but with the whisper of ink. He handed the crown not to a rival, not to a conqueror, but to history itself. When the news reached Petrograd, people poured into the streets. Church bells rang not for joy, but for awakening. Some wept, others cheered. The old world was gone, but Nicholas was strangely calm. In his diary he wrote, "All around is betrayal, cowardice, and deceit." Even in defeat, he saw himself as a martyr, not a man. He believed abdication was temporary, that soon the people would call him back. But the people had moved on. The monarchy was not asleep. It was dead, And yet, even fallen emperors must live somewhere. So the family was taken under guard to the Alexander Palace, then to Tobolsk, then finally to Ekaterinburg, from golden halls to wooden rooms, from servants to soldiers. The empire that once obeyed their every word now rationed their bread. The Tsar who had ruled millions was now a prisoner of a government that no longer knew what to do with him. Still, Nicholas remained eerily serene. He chopped wood, read to his children, prayed daily. He believed God would deliver him. Alexandra clung to the same faith. She wrote letters filled with hope and prophecy. But in Petrograd, another power had risen, the Bolsheviks. They spoke not of God or destiny, but of equality and vengeance. To them, Nicholas was not a fallen ruler. He was a symbol of centuries of oppression. His survival was a danger, his existence an insult. But before the final reckoning, another ghost had to fall, Rasputin. The mystic had grown too powerful, too infamous. He moved through the palace like a shadow that refused to die. Rumors painted him as a demon, a seducer, a sorcerer whispering poison into the Serena's ear. Even loyal monarchists saw him as a curse. In December 1916, a group of nobles decided to save the throne by killing its savior. They invited Rasputin to a midnight feast. He arrived in his usual black robes, smelling of incense and wine. They offered him cakes laced with cyanide, wine poured like blood. He ate, drank, smiled, and did not die. Hours passed. The poison did nothing. Panic took hold. One of the nobles drew a gun and shot him. Rasputin fell, eyes wide, blood pooling on the carpet. But when they leaned in, he moved again, crawling, staggering, gasping for life. They shot him again and again. Finally, they dragged him to the river and dropped his body through the ice. When it was found days later, his lungs were full of water. He had drowned. Rasputin's death was supposed to save the monarchy. Instead, it sealed its doom. Without him, Alexandra was broken. Without her, Nicholas was lost. The empire, already dying, began to rot. When the Bolsheviks took power later that year, they promised peace, bread, and land. But what they really delivered was blood. Civil war erupted. Reds against whites, brother against brother. Russia became a graveyard of ideologies. In the chaos, the Romanovs faded into obscurity, watched by guards who barely knew what to do with them. They were no longer rulers, just relics. Yet even then, Nicholas clung to faith. He wrote in his diary about sunsets, snowfalls, his children's laughter. He seemed detached from the ruins of the world outside his window. Perhaps he couldn't face it. Perhaps he refused to. And then came the night, July 17, 1918, the basement of the Ipatiev House, a small, damp room. The family was woken under the pretext of being moved. They dressed quickly, half asleep, carrying pillows, Icon's hope. Nicholas held Alexei's hand. Alexandra whispered prayers. The guards stood silent, uneasy. When the family entered the room, chairs were arranged as if for a photograph. They sat. Nicholas looked up. "Is there not a chair for Alexei?" he asked quietly. The commandant nodded. Then came the words that ended an empire. "Your relatives have tried to save you, but now they cannot. You must be shot." Nicholas barely had time to respond. He turned to his family. Then the shots began. The sound was chaos, deafening, final. Smoke filled the room, screams, confusion. Bullets ricocheted off jewels sewn into the daughters' corsets. Bayonets finished what bullets could not. And then silence. The Romanovs were gone. The dynasty that ruled for 3 centuries had been erased in less than 20 minutes. Outside, the world kept turning. The guards wrapped the bodies in sheets, poured acid, burned what they could, buried the rest in the forest. The empire of the Tsars vanished into the earth like a bad dream. The new world, the world of Lenin, of revolution, of red banners, was born in its ashes. But what do we make of Nicholas? Was he evil? No. Was he cruel? Rarely. He was something worse, ordinary. A man born into a role too vast for his soul. He was gentle in private, ruthless in principle, blind to consequence. He believed he ruled by divine right, yet could not see that God had left the palace long before the people did. His tragedy wasn't that he was incompetent. It was that he was sincere. He truly believed he was doing good. And history has no mercy for men like that. Even now, when you walk through the palaces of St. Petersburg, you can feel it. The ghost of Nicholas C. lingering in the mirrors, a man trapped forever between duty and delusion. His portraits show a calm face, soft eyes, neatly trimmed beard. You wouldn't see the weight of millions of lives in them. You wouldn't see the collapse of centuries. But look closely, and maybe you'll see it. The faint shadow of a man watching everything he believed in turn to dust. The flicker of realization that came too late. In the end, Nicholas didn't lose his empire in a single moment. He lost it in 1,000 quiet ones, in every letter ignored, every plea dismissed, every prayer that replaced action. Empires don't fall because of one mistake. They fall because of a pattern of belief, an illusion repeated until it becomes fatal. Nicholas lived and died inside that illusion. He thought he was chosen by God, but in truth, he was chosen by history, to be the symbol of how even the mightiest thrones can crumble when they forget the world beneath them. And so, when we look back on Nicholas II, the question isn't whether he was the most incompetent king ever. It's whether any man could have survived the weight of the past he carried. He was born into a story already ending. By the time he realized it, the ink was dry, and somewhere in that cold Siberian night, where the last Tsar met his fate, you can almost hear it still, the echo of a man whispering prayers into a silence that would never answer. The empire had died, but its shadow remained. You could still feel it in the cold wind that swept through the empty halls of the Winter Palace. The chandeliers still hung there, glittering like frozen tears. The portraits of saints and czars still watched in silence, their painted eyes unable to comprehend what had become of their blood. The snow outside was indifferent. Russia had moved on. But the ghosts, they lingered. In the decades that followed, the name Nicholas Tsar was not spoken with reverence nor hatred, but with unease. He was a ghost of an age that no one could quite bury. The Bolsheviks tried. They erased him from history books, burned his symbols, dismantled his monuments. Yet the past has a strange way of surviving, even when denied. His story was whispered in secret, carried in memories, hidden in icons behind doors that no longer locked. Because even revolutions cannot erase the feeling of having lost something enormous, even if that something was flawed. Nicholas had not just ruled an empire, he had embodied a myth that the Tsar was the living bridge between heaven and earth. When that bridge collapsed, Russia did not fall into reason, it fell into the abyss. Civil war devoured the land. Cities turned to battlefields, families turned to enemies. The ideals that replaced the crown promised equality, but brought hunger, fear, and purges. The people had traded one god for another. And as Lenin's body lay embalmed in Red Square, the irony was complete. The revolution that killed divine monarchy had created its own saints, its own rituals, its own unspoken Tsar. But back to the man behind the myth. In his last diary entry, Nicholas wrote simply, "The weather is warm." The children played outdoors. There is something haunting in that simplicity. No mention of politics, no bitterness. Just the voice of a man watching the world collapse through the window of domestic normalcy. That, perhaps, is what makes him unforgettable. Not his power, but his detachment from it. He ruled a country he never truly knew. His people starved while he worried about the weather. He loved his family fiercely, but never learned to love his nation as anything other than an idea. He wanted to be a good man, but goodness without understanding can become cruelty in disguise. When historians look back at Nicholas II, they argue about his competence, his courage, his failures. But none of those words quite capture him. He was a man of another century, trapped in the wrong one. He was born to rule a medieval world of peasants and prayer, yet lived to see telegraphs, factories, and revolutions. His crown was an antique in an age of machines. The tragedy wasn't that he was evil, it was that he was obsolete, like a candle burning in the age of electricity. He didn't know how to dim his own light before it set the world on fire, and still, there's something painfully human in his fall. The way he clung to faith when reason would have served him better. The way he loved his wife beyond politics, trusted his friends beyond sense, forgave his enemies too late. History mocks men like Nicholas, but secretly, it mourns them too, because their failure reminds us how fragile our own certainties are, how quickly belief becomes blindness, how devotion becomes destruction. The Tsar was not a monster, he was a mirror. Even his killers felt it. After the execution, the guards who carried the bodies into the woods spoke little of what they had done. Some drank themselves into silence. Others vanished. One later confessed that when he saw the faces of the children, he couldn't pull the trigger. He looked into their eyes and saw not aristocrats, but people. And maybe that's the cruelest irony of all. Nicholas ruled believing he was divinely separate from humanity, but in death he became human again. A man, a father, a body lying in the dirt. Decades later, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, the bones of the Romanovs were unearthed from the forest outside Ekaterinburg. Scientists studied them, politicians debated them, priests blessed them. In 1998, 80 years after the execution, their remains were reburied with state honors in St. Petersburg's Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, the resting place of the Tsars. Soldiers saluted. Bells rang. The descendants of both monarchists and revolutionaries stood side by side, not in celebration, but in uneasy reconciliation. Russia was not forgiving its past, it was acknowledging it. The last Tsar had come home, not as ruler but as relic. Even now, the argument continues. Was Nicholas Sequin a martyr or a fool? A saint or a symbol of everything that went wrong with the old world? In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized him and his family as passion-bearers, holy sufferers who met death with dignity. The same people whose ancestors once tore down his statues now lit candles in his name. History, it seems, has a taste for cruel symmetry. But beyond saints and sinners, beyond kings and executioners, there's something deeper here, a story about how belief can destroy what it tries to protect. Nicholas believed in order, in God, in the sacred bond between ruler and ruled. He believed so deeply that he refused to see when that bond had broken. The people believed in revolution, in progress, in a better tomorrow. They believed so deeply that they forgot compassion in pursuit of justice. And between those two faiths, one dying, one newborn, lay a field of corpses. The Romanovs were just the first among millions. History loves to crown villains and heroes, but Nicholas fits neither role. He is not Macbeth, consumed by ambition, nor Nero, drunk with cruelty. He is Hamlet, paralyzed, reflective, too noble for action, too blind for survival. He stands on the edge of a collapsing stage, asking questions no one will answer, while the audience watches the curtain burn. That's why his story still feels alive. Because it's not just about him. It's about all of us. About what happens when power meets faith, when belief collides with change, when human frailty sits on divine thrones. Close your eyes and imagine him one last time, not as a ruler, not as a ghost, but as a man. The faint crackle of fire outside, the smell of earth and gunpowder. He's standing somewhere in memory, dressed not in royal robes, but in the plain clothes of exile. His hands tremble slightly as he lights a candle. The flame flickers. For a moment, his face softens, as if he understands everything now, the weight of centuries, the futility of crowns, the cost of blind faith. And then the wind blows, and the light goes out. The empire goes with it. But perhaps there's a lesson in that darkness, That power without empathy is just another kind of blindness. That every throne built on fear will one day stand empty, and that no man, no matter how chosen, how sacred, how certain, can command the tide of history. Nicholas tried, he prayed, he believed. He waited for a miracle that never came, and in doing so, he became the last echo of an age that mistook obedience for peace, silence for loyalty, and faith for destiny. The Romanovs are dust now. The palaces are museums. The empire they ruled has dissolved and reformed and dissolved again. Yet in the silence of those marble corridors, when the night is deep and the snow falls softly outside, you can almost hear it. The sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. A man walking slowly, head bowed, as if still searching for the answer that history never gave him. And maybe that's the only way to understand Nicholas Saki, not as the most incompetent king ever, but as the last believer in a world that no longer existed, a man born into divine certainty, undone by human reality. His empire fell not because he ruled poorly, but because he ruled alone, surrounded by faith, blinded by love, abandoned by time. The final chapter of his story isn't written in blood or marble, but in silence. The silence of a palace that once ruled half the world. The silence of a people who outlived their Tsar. The silence of history itself, waiting, always waiting, for someone to learn what he never could, that no throne stands forever, and no crown shines brighter than the truth.